In the 17th century, when the rest of Europe reeled under an acute crisis, England gradually rose to power and prosperity.
During the 17th century crisis, England created the necessary preconditions which were essential for the breakthrough into the capitalist mode of production.
Even though London became the hub of economic activities, the foundation of the prosperity was laid by an agricultural revolution.
One must keep in mind that from the 15th century onwards, England was, or the capitalist farmers, or let's talk about the landed aristocracy, was actually successful in increasing the extent of their farmlands. So you have bigger farmlands in England compared to the rest of Europe. And a process which started in the 15th century witnessed its high water mark during the 17th century, largely because of the Civil War. Whatever impediments were there in the way of the acquisition of large landed estates were removed during the Civil War. And we find in England about say 70 to 75% of the arable land actually brought under the plough, where we have large landed estates and not the segregated small landed properties that existed in continental Europe.
Historians have identified enclosure, mechanization, four-field crop rotation, and selective breeding as primary causes for the remarkable increase in agricultural productivity.
What happened was this, that the land or the extent of the landed estates in England increased because the very small farmers with a very limited land were in no position to retain those small holdings. They were forced to sell those small holdings, and eventually we find what is called capitalist farming in England.
In the open field system, large tracts of land had common ownership. Farmers cultivated on separate strips of land in these tracts and split up the produce after the harvest. In the 15th and 16th centuries, some of the common fields in Britain were enclosed into individually owned fields. This led to farmers losing their land and their grazing rights, and left many impoverished.
Now one might raise the question that where the landed aristocracy was concerned, they must have pressurized the tenants to pay them exorbitant rents. This is true, but one must also keep in mind the fact that the tenants actually evolved into capitalist tenants, whereby they introduced various changes and various whereby they initiated the process of scientific cultivation in their farmlands, thereby increasing productivity, so that even though rents were very high, they did not actually suffer, because whatever extra they produced, they could keep for themselves. And thereby, we find that there was a general prosperity, because these tenant farmers again could always draw their requirements for labor from the pool of wage laborers that were there in Europe. These wage laborers actually were those who became landless because of the acquisition of property by the rich capitalist farmers.
Even though the practice of enclosure was denounced by the church, the requirements of agricultural mechanization called for large enclosed fields in order to be profitable. Jethro Tull made early advancements in agricultural technology with his seed drill, a mechanical seeder which distributed seeds efficiently across a plot of land. The Rotherham plough and the Scots plough helped the farmer to till the land more efficiently and with less strain.
The English farmer was quick to react to these changes which was occurring not only in England, but of course in England, but in the rest of Europe. Where continental Europe was concerned, where the rest of Europe was concerned, this transition was not so swift. Again, if you look at the enclosures, you will find the rearing of sheep. The rearing of sheep is very significant because sheep not only provided meat, but also provided a very important item, that is wool. One of the reasons as to why England became the predominant or the most important power as far as the textile industry was concerned. And if you look at the agricultural sector also, if you look at the growth of food grains as such, we will see that there was this very significant development in England was this, that along with the growth of food grains, we find the rearing of animals was also very important, and this was done side by side in one farm. And we find that to meet the requirements of the animals that were reared, we find that the English farmer grew these forage crops, fodder for the cattle, food for the sheep.
The farmers discovered an effective four-field rotation system. In the season when land was left fallow, they grew turnip and clover. Clover was an agent in improving soil fertility by fixing nitrogen. It was also an ideal fodder crop. So the improved grain production simultaneously increased livestock production.
In fact, a very significant system is the Norfolk system, whereby we find that it was a four-yearly sequence. It was a four-yearly sequence. The first year was grown wheat, the second year turnip, the third year barley, and the fourth year clover. What is the significance of crop rotation? The crops that are grown, if you grow the same type of crops, then the soil nutrients that are used are the same. So the fertility of the soil decreases. But if you rotate crops, because each crop requires different soil nutrients, then what happens is this, that if you grow, say, barley in the second year, then say a turnip in the third year, what happens is this, that the soil fertility returns. So crop rotation has this advantage, and again, forage crops are nitrogen fixers. They fix the nitrogen of the soil, and thereby they increase the fertility of the soil.
Farmers could grow more livestock because there was more food of higher quality, and the manure was an excellent fertilizer. So they could have even more productive crops. The new techniques led to remarkably higher production. Villages that had earlier been happy to be merely self-sufficient now began to look to produce for the market. The changes involved the adoption of a new capitalist business ethic by the farmers. Better transport facilities also played a part. It became easier for farmers to transport grains to the market.
Where the Marxists and the Neo-Malthusians are concerned, they also emphasized the social differentiation in land. They say that this was also a period where England witnessed a transition in the manorial economies based on lord and serf to peasant agriculture, and over a long term to capitalist farming. So this transition from a manorial economy where you have the lord on the one hand and the serf on the other, next the transition is to what? Peasant agriculture, and the peasant agriculture is actually the interim period. Ultimately you have capitalist farming. This is the argument of the Marxists and the Neo Malthusians, who say that these were the reasons as to why the agricultural development in England witnessed that kind of progress which was not replicated anywhere else in Europe.
In Britain, in 1750, the population reached 5.7 million. So there was enough demand for this increased agricultural production. The increase in population also led to more demand for goods such as clothing.
Along with agrarian capitalism, another thing also comes, that is the impoverishment of the rural areas. If you're talking about agrarian capitalism, it means that land is actually getting or a sizable amount of, in fact most of the land in England was getting concentrated in the hands of a few people. What about the rest? The rest became landless. How would England sustain these people who became landless? These were the people who would be used as wage laborers. Now, what is important regarding the agricultural scenario in England at this time is that it resulted in the proletarianization of a broad strata of the populations. Why? Now we find the enclosures are a very complex kind of a agricultural setup, and it was not possible for anyone to get these enclosures. For example, when the monastic lands were sold off, it was not a small farmer who bought the monastic lands. It was only the mercantilist capitalist who resided in the urban areas, or the rich capitalist farmer who was in a position to buy these lands. So what happened to the rest of the people? The rest of the people were increasingly marginalized, and in due course of time they became landless. If you assess the situation, then it would appear that England was actually going towards that situation whereby you have only a class of very rich people and the others are all paupers. But in England this does not happen.
The landless, impoverished laborers found jobs in the cottage industry. That was a stepping stone to the Industrial Revolution.
এই সময় তো ইংল্যান্ডের শহরাঞ্চলে শিল্প বাণিজ্যের বেশ বিকাশ ঘটেছে। তো ম্যাম, গ্রামাঞ্চলে যারা কৃষিকাজ করে বা যারা ওয়েজ লেবারার্স, তাদের মধ্যে মানে শহরাঞ্চলে চলে যাওয়ার কি কোনো প্রবণতা দেখা দিচ্ছে না?
There were rural industries also. If you look at the rural industries, I was actually coming to that. The rural industries came, or rather, along with agriculture, there existed industries which were formed during that time, which is called the period of Proto-Industrialization. Now, one of the reasons as to why the countryside in England prospered as far as industrialization is concerned is because the industrialization in the rural areas were mostly agro-based industries. If you look at textile industry, or if you look at, say, wool, let's talk about wool. Now what happens? The sheep are reared in enclosures. Now you have to shear the wool, shear the sheep, you shear them, you wash them. Where do you wash them? You can't take them to the city and wash them. So you need to have a factory near a water body, which is generally much more convenient in the rural areas. So you have the development of the primary woolen industry in the village. To clean wool, to shear sheep, you need labor. How will you get it? In France, this is not possible. Why? Because they are very small holdings. No one would leave their land to go and shear sheep. In England, this is possible. Why? Because I have said that most of the land, 70 to 75% of the land in England by the 17th century had come under capitalist farmers. What about the rest of the population? Where would they go? they were the ones who would be engaged in these professions. Of course, during the Industrial Revolution, one of the reasons as to why England witnessed the Industrial Revolution first in Europe was because you had this sizable wage labor to fall back on. Now, when the rural industries were exhausted, what would you have? You would have these people all going to London or the urban centers to and they would be employed by the various industries. Yes, what the changes that occurred in the agrarian sector were instrumental in creating a labor force which could be used by the industrialists or which could be used by the capitalists in their industrial enterprises later on.
The British Agricultural Revolution was the cause of drastic changes in the lives of British women. Earlier, women worked alongside their husbands in the fields. The increased efficiency of this new machinery, along with the fact that this new machinery was often heavier and difficult for a woman to work, made the role of women redundant in the agricultural fields. Women were relegated to playing secondary roles in society. To supplement the family's income, many went into cottage industries. Others became domestic servants or were forced into professions such as prostitution. This new limited role of women has been dubbed by one historian as this defamation of women workers.
The crisis of production, according to Marxist historians, was a general phenomenon throughout Europe. It was not, of course, only concentrated, or it was not only something which was seen in England, it was seen throughout Europe. But it was only in England, this is very significant, this is only in England, according to Marxist historians, that the forces of capitalism, owing to their greater development and representation in Parliament, something that was not witnessed elsewhere in Europe, were able to triumph. So why is it that if there was a general crisis in production throughout Europe, why is it that in England the manifestation of this crisis was very different from the rest of Europe? That was precisely because England was in a situation because of I won't say representative government, but because of the preponderance of the parliament in England and the development of the capitalist classes and their representation in parliament, that we find the growth and development of the capitalist farmers in England, something which was not witnessed in rest of Europe. And this led to what we are calling the development in the production process, where we find a revolution or where we find a change in the mode of production, whereby from a peasant agriculture there is this transformation into capitalist farming or capitalist agriculture. Another very significant development as far as England is concerned is the development of the home market. Now, when we're talking about the production for mass consumption, we are talking about a demand that is created in the home market. How is a demand how is demand created in the home market? The fact is that by the time you come to the 17th century, you will find remunerations being made in cash. Cash purchases also are being made. So now, what do you see? That there is the availability of money in the economy, cash in the economy, which in its turn again helps first trade and commerce, and then the process of industrialization, because this is the time where we find the evolution of the financial instruments, which is so very important first in England's overseas commercial ventures and later on in the process of industrialization in England. But what is important to remember is that England progressed far ahead of its European counterparts precisely because there was demand in the domestic market. It was not, the production was not based on demand or the production was not based on external factors only. Yes, it is true that England acquired colonies. The colonies were very good captive markets where they could sell their products, but this was an added benefit as far as England was concerned. In fact, it was not only England who possessed colonies, there were other European powers who possessed colonies too. But where England differed from from its European counterparts was here that there was a sizable domestic demand for its product. There is a transition in the production process whereby we see products being produced for mass consumption. Previously, what did we see? We saw that when products were imported, what kind of products were imported? The products that were imported were actually meant for luxury consumption. Now, the products which are being produced in England is for mass consumption. So there is, and this gives a stimuli. If you just produce for one small class of people, then the process of industrialization does not or cannot sustain itself or cannot progress beyond a certain limit. But if you produce for the masses, then the demand is such that it keeps increasing and your industrial development also keeps increasing with this. This is so very different in England. This experience is so very different in England when compared to the rest of Europe.
ম্যাম, এই চাহিদাটা যে সৃষ্টি হচ্ছে সেটা কি শুধুমাত্র ইংল্যান্ডের নিজস্ব বাজার আর কলোনি মানে ইংল্যান্ডের কলোনিগুলোর ভেতর নাকি ইউরোপের বিভিন্ন দেশের মধ্যে ইংল্যান্ডের পণ্যের প্রতি একটা চাহিদা সৃষ্টি হচ্ছে?
The demand is the first demand in England, where England differed from its European counterparts, is that it had a domestic demand, a sizable domestic demand, a domestic demand which triggered of mass production. Secondly, where English woolen products were concerned, later on even grain, corn for example was concerned, it had a ready market in Europe. Thirdly, where we find the colonies, it's a different experience altogether because we've been just talking about the plantation economy. Where the plantation economy is concerned, you are assured of raw materials, and where the captive market is concerned, you are assured of selling your goods there. But this is something which the whole of Europe it should be the same, the case should be the same with the whole of Europe. But where I am trying to stress the point is, where England differed from the rest of Europe was here, that there was a sizable domestic demand for its goods.
তার কারণ কি এটা যে ইংল্যান্ডের মানুষের নিজস্ব জীবন ধারণের মানটা অনেকটা উন্নত ছিল অন্যান্য দেশের তুলনায়?
Precisely. When we're talking about capitalist farming, when we're talking about prosperity, there's a general prosperity in England. Prosperity which is actually triggered by capitalist farming, where you find an increase in the productive levels. So there is greater availability of goods. And if you think that because of capitalist farming, there is a sizable section of the population which is unemployed, then we think wrong. Because even prior to the capitalist development of farming, we were talking about proto-industrialization. Why is it? One of the factors as to why you have proto-industrialization is because there is unemployment or underemployment in the rural sectors. So people actually foray into a different avenue altogether, whereby they think that they will produce certain items for which there is a demand in the village, and thereby they would eke out a living. Where the case of England is concerned, because of capitalist farming, it is true that a sizable section, what we were talking about, the proletarization of the population, it is true. But this population were not unemployed. They were absorbed in the various ventures, industrial ventures, as well as in the process of farming in England. So they were not employed. And as there was prosperity in agriculture, obviously wages also rose. And if the population in the 17th century declined due to warfare, due to diseases, then what happens? There's a dearth of wage labor. And if there's a dearth of wage labor, then obviously wages is going to increase. So there is availability of money. There's availability, or there is a greater purchasing power of the people. Not only this, there is a significant turn towards the cash economy, where we find the evolution of the financial instruments. In fact, in due course of time, after Amsterdam, London would become the financial capital of the world. And this is, according to historians, or the point that I'm trying to stress is that the breakthrough where England achieved the breakthrough in comparison to the other European powers was this, that the breakthrough was in the rural sector, in the rural social structure, which was conducive to mass production. It was not only production of luxury items, not only production for only one, say the aristocracy or the rich farmers. It was also production for the general mass of the people. This was where England differed from the rest of Europe. And that is why we find that one triggers the other. You have capitalist farming in England. Along with this, you have the agricultural revolution, then the commercial revolution, and eventually all these leading to the industrial revolution.
The Industrial Revolution catapulted England to a position of preeminence among the nations of the world. On the strength of this revolution, it gradually built up an empire where the sun reportedly never set.
The creation of the nation state actually did not hamper the progress of agriculture and industrialization in England as it did in the various continental countries.
But it also degraded the quality of life of a large number of people.